All right, parents, maybe you've heard of us, maybe you haven't, but we see tons of kids with neurodivergent challenges, whether that be autism, ADHD, PANS, tics, things of that nature, right? Stimming. So what I'm going to walk you through is the brain that's behind that behavior that we're trying to improve, okay? So your brain, when you're born, obviously hasn't fully developed, right? Your brain needs input to develop, and your brain is built bottom up and inside out. So we're going to talk about both of those, okay? So just like a house, you want the foundation to be strong, because if the foundation's off, everything else is going to be off, right? In order to get executive function, which is ability to think, learn, carry out tasks, succeed in life, your brain has to develop in the sequence bottom up and inside out, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it starts with movement. Your brain loves movement. Just like after someone exercises, they feel great, have that runner's high, that euphoria. It's because your brain craves movement when we're an adult. It also builds your brain as a child. Your brain needs input from our body in order to develop, to know where the body's at in space, okay? And that was automatic, primitive, reflexive movements, okay? So when I say automatic, think primitive reflexes, okay? They're infantile survival reflexes that a child is born with. We want them present when they're little. We then want them to go away as the brain matures. As an example, you flick the corner of an infant's mouth with a bottle or a nipple, they'll instantly start moving and try to root. It's a rooting reflex, right? Survival mechanism. They need to eat. Their brain doesn't know what it is, but their brain knows it needs to eat to survive, so it's automatic movement. You put your finger in their palm, what will they do? They'll automatically grasp it, right? These are reflexive movements. Well, what's happening is every time, and these are housed in the brainstem, okay? That's why they're green, bottom up, right? Right here in the back of your neck. That's where that brainstem lives, that's where those reflexes live, okay? You want those reflexes present because every time that child moves their hand, moves their mouth, and there's other reflexes as well, they're literally sending signals up through that hand to this cerebellum, the blue part, the right cerebellum, over to the left side of the brain. The brain and the cerebellum are starting to realize where their hand's at in space, where their mouth is at. The brain is starting to connect with the body, if you will, with these reflexive movements. You then want those reflexes to go away. All of them should go away within the first year of life. Most of them should go within the first 6 to 8 months of life, okay? Because what happens is, at that point in time, from the first 0 to 6 months, kids aren't really moving. You know, they're just kind of there. We're doing everything for them. But then kids start to lift their head, right? They start to army crawl, and they start to crawl. So what happens is we start getting more complex movement patterns, right? Where the brain is actually coordinating these movements versus reflexively having these movements, okay? So eventually we start with these reflexes. Eventually we get more coordinated reflexes. And when you think of coordinated reflexes, I want you to think of the cerebellum. Hence the blue. It's only about 10% of the brain size, but it houses 80% of the brain's neurons. Okay, it's the most important aspect of the brain. It literally coordinates everything in the brain. It ties into executive function, it ties into motor planning, smooth movements, emotional stuff. Everything is tied to the cerebellum. 80% of the kids that come in here have a cerebellum issue, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit, okay? So you get these more coordinated movements. So these infantile reflexes can go away because we get more coordinated movements. As the brain continues to, so you start to crawl, then you sit and you stand, you get these more coordinated movements, you then start to form cortical networks in the brain. All right, I'm talking like speech networks, attention networks, emotional networks, right? And then eventually, as these all integrate together, and our brain is mature, we have all these networks functioning well and integrating well, you then get executive function, okay? The reason this is so important is because executive function is housed here at the top of the brain. The brain is built bottom up to the front. You're not born with that ability. That ability, that has to happen in this sequential order. If it doesn't, there's no way you're gonna have executive function. And that's why your child struggles sitting still. That's why maybe they have fine motor skills like speech delay. They have emotional dysregulation. Because the brain hasn't matured enough to coordinate those networks appropriately. So I highly recommend you get your child screened for primitive reflexes. But another thing is, if the brain has inflammation and it does not have enough energy, it also cannot form these connections. So a lot of times kiddos that come in here, they have either brain inflammation, maybe they have autoimmunity against their cerebellum, maybe they have a gluten issue that's attacking their cerebellum, maybe they had strep or Epstein-Barr virus when they were little, not bound to the cerebellum or bound to their basal ganglia. And what that does, it prevents all this from happening appropriately. And the reason I like to say that is because in our office here, we use red light therapy, infrared, red, violet, green, laser therapy, because what that has proven is called photobiomodulation. What that does is it decreases inflammation in the brain and increases energy in the brain. So as we start rehabbing these kids, because the brain is built like a muscle, and that the more information that you can give to it, the stronger, more efficient it can become. So we laser these kids, literally their brains, to decrease inflammation, increase energy, while then doing specific rehab techniques to start strengthening this and start doing it from the bottom up. And the reason this is so important, again, is because if a kid can't sit still, or they don't have attention networks, what do? We try and teach them to sit still. Right? A kid can't speak, we do more speaking stuff. A kid can't write well, they don't have good fine motor skills, we try and make them write more. That's not the problem. The problem is that their brain didn't develop optimally to coordinate those things. When you improve the networks in the brain, when you do therapy and rehab, following this bottom-up approach, the behavior naturally gets better because you're changing the brain the way that it was developing the way it was supposed to develop in the first place. Okay, so that's the bottom-up approach. Next is the inside out, which is the cerebellum, which again is huge, right? 10% in size, 80% function of the brain. Okay, cerebellum looks like kind of like a little mushroom on the back of your head, if you will. This is a back to front view of it. So there's a midline portion, which is that M there. There's intermediate, which is the blue. Then there's a lateral, which is the L. Your cerebellum really starts to integrate from these reflexes, but as we get more coordinated movements especially. The midline cerebellum begins, so the midline cerebellum controls the midline of our body. So think middle core, okay? Midline begins to develop when a baby's on their tummy and they lift their head. Well, nowadays, thanks to the Back to Sleep program, no babies are ever on their tummy, right? So they never stimulate their core, they never stimulate that midline cerebellum. The intermediate cerebellum, so first a kid should be on their tummy, lifting their head, just kind of moving around, right? Building that cerebellum. Then they start to army crawl. So intermediate cerebellum is more kind of shoulders and hips, just a little bit wider, right? So that's when we do army crawling. We start building that. And then the lateral cerebellum, which is actually called your cerebrocerebellum, because it actually ties in to executive function. That's how important the cerebellum is, especially the lateral part. That's when we actually cross crawl. So think more fine motor. We're getting our hands and our feet involved. We're getting, so that's legit cross crawl and fine motor skills, which is speech, right? Handwriting, things of that nature, which is why oftentimes handwriting is not a fine motor skill issue. It is, but it's because they never develop their midline, intermediate, and lateral cerebellum accordingly. So versus trying to teach handwriting or teach speech, why don't we just strengthen their lateral cerebellum? Because that's what's coordinating the fine motor skills anyway, okay? And I like to talk about this because a lot of primitive reflexes kind of go hand in hand with the cerebellum because those are the foundation. So a lot of times kids have an asymmetric tonic neck reflex or a symmetric tonic neck reflex or a tonic labyrinthine reflex. It's a sign that the midline cerebellum didn't optimally develop. If the midline didn't develop, there's no way the intermediate and lateral could have developed as well, okay? So checking these primitive reflexes is so crucial because they directly tie into the cerebellum and how it's developing. And again, that's from the inside out approach. So to kind of summarize for you guys, this whole thing, the brain behind the behavior, behavior's an effect, okay? If Johnny could sit still, he would. His brain's not letting him because it didn't develop accordingly, okay? If Johnny would love to talk if he could, but he didn't develop the speech networks that his brain intended him to, because he didn't move accordingly. Maybe he has that rooting reflex or the palmar grasp, both highly tied to speech. Cerebellum developed. Why? Johnny never crawled. He went straight to walking. A lot of people say, well, he's advanced. It's actually a delay. Okay, your brain develops in these sequences, and if you skip something, you don't do it long enough, then those areas of the brain aren't going to fully develop optimally, and you're going to be left with abnormal behavior, because the brain controls everything, including behavior. All right. Couple things with this. A huge thing to keep in mind is the age of 10. Okay. By the age of 10, the structural components of our brain are there. You can't create them. Now you can continue to get great results with these kids after the age of 10, as long as those networks are there, because you can improve the efficiency within those networks. But if you bring me a nonverbal child who's 12 years old, they may never be able to speak if that speech network never developed. It could be that the speech network developed, it just didn't form good connections, and in that case we can get great results. Okay, so don't only think if your child's over the age of 10 we can't get results. We still can, by improving the efficiency within those networks. It's called neuroplasticity. But the returns might be somewhat diminished returns, just because those networks may not have developed, and there's no way of knowing that. The only way of seeing what kind of results we can get is trying, stimulating the brain everywhere they can, decreasing inflammation, taking a therapeutic approach from the bottom up, because that's how the brain develops, versus top down, trying to teach and trying to have them do more things that they can't do anyway, because the brain hasn't developed, if that makes sense. So age 10 is a big one, because remember, these reflexes should go away by about 6 to 8 months. So if they're still present in your 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old, they haven't gone away in 5.5 to 9.5 years, they're never going to go away until we start to rehab them. And once you rehab them, they go away, then we can start working on some more cerebellum stuff, right? Some more core stability, some more balance and coordination type stuff. And then we can start to get those networks to fire and to create themselves, basically. And then over time, get that executive function, which is what you want for your child, right? The ability to succeed in life, think, learn, carry out tasks, have focus, all those sorts of things. So just a little visual for you guys. Hopefully it makes sense. I'll post a video here in the near future about how to check reflexes and stuff on your child. But if you guys have any interest in learning more what we do here, just reach out via messenger or shoot us a text, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.